If you're an Aussie boxing fan, then you're probably really disappointed. And if you're a Tim Tszyu supporter and Tim Tszyu fan, you're very disappointed. Tim Tszyu losing to Bakhrum Murtazaliev in the third round via TKO. It was a dominant performance by Bakhrum Murtazaliev. Now, I think there are multiple reasons why this could have happened for Tim and why he could have performed the way that he did and lost the way he did. Some of them are valid, some of them are maybe that's the case, maybe it's not, maybe it means nothing. But there are two key points that I think is the reason why Tim Tszyu lost his fight. And there is an interview that to me explains it all. And in this video, I'll try to analyze exactly what happened between Tim Tszyu and Bakhrum Murtazaliev. Let's dive in. It's not the fact that Tim lost, it's the way he lost that made this a big upset. If he had just lost via unanimous decision, it'd be a different story. However, getting demolished the way he did and beaten over 3 rounds, that is an upset. And considering he was the favorite, that makes it an upset. Yes, I paid my $69.95 to watch 3 fights. 3 good fights, but 3 fights nevertheless. I think I'd be a lot more happier if I just paid an Amazon subscription instead of paying this ridiculous pay-per-view amount. But it is what it is. So why did this upset happen? Let's look at some factors that could have contributed to this happening and this fight going the way that it did, with Tim getting knocked out in the 3rd round. Okay, let's talk about pressure. And there's a few elements of pressure that Tim Tszyu had on him, which is fine. He's had pressure on him in the past, but I just want to sort of highlight these pressures, and they could have been a contributing factor, or maybe they weren't. We don't know. Tim Tszyu has been having a lot more interviews. He's gaining popularity over in the US since his fight with Sebastian Fundora. So that is another bit more pressure that was put on him in terms of the build up to this fight. And then on top of that, his dad comes to this fight all the way from Russia. His dad comes over. The first time he's seen him fight, this is his debut. So if that's not pressure, I don't know what is. So if you think about it, he had his dad there, he had his brother there, he had his grandfather there, he had his whole team there. All his family that's close to him was there. So that is pressure put on Tim not to fail in front of all of his family members. Maybe it wasn't really a big thing and it was in the back of his mind, and maybe it was something it didn't really faze him, but it's still a factor that could have possibly been one of the contributing parts to him losing. Probably not. It's probably not a big deal. It's only a small thing. It's just more pressure. He did also put more pressure on himself by saying things like, the Tszyu family is going to be the greatest family in boxing history. That's putting a lot of pressure on yourself leading up to a world title fight. Another factor could be Tim looking past his opponent. He was focusing on fighting the next fighter like Fundora, like claiming that revenge, and not really paying too much attention to the current fighter in front of him. Yeah, I think he was focused on this fighter to an extent, but he was also seeing past him, and that's one thing you don't want to do as a fighter. You never want to look past the fighter that's in front of you, because that's when a disaster like this happens. But again, it could be a factor in this, but it might not mean anything. It's just something I wanted to highlight that could have potentially been a factor in him losing this fight. And it's not one thing, it's accumulative. It's multiple things stacked on top of each other. So that's how I'm sort of looking at these factors leading up to the fight that could have contributed to the loss. Okay, another factor, and this is kind of an odd one, could maybe mean nothing, but the atmosphere, the crowd. Tim Tszyu has been fighting mostly in Australia. He's had a couple of fights in America, but most of his fights have been in Australia, and most of them fights have been big fights, especially the ones that were world title fights or leading up to a world title. So there were some big crowds, and having big crowds helps you push and actually get through the fight and perform better, that rush. Sometimes as you get higher in the rankings, it propels you. It helps you get past certain challenges within the fight. And he could have become accustomed to having that crowd behind him as an advantage, especially fighting in Australia when you have a lot more of a fan base in Australia. So you have a lot more people backing you and cheering you on. So that lifts you up and that helps you get through the fight and get through them challenges. I'm not saying that he can't do that anyway, because he's proven that he has been able to get through challenges like the Fundora fight, like this fight that just happened, getting up 5 times, but he still had challenges in the fight that he couldn't get through and couldn't get past, like maintaining his defense, especially after getting dropped the first time, covering up, tying up, things like that. So that's another one. Could be one of the factors. Maybe it means nothing, don't know, but just want to mention it. Okay, let's get down to the 2 reasons why I think he lost this fight. And they kind of tie in with each other as well. Let's talk about the game plan of both fighters. Tim Tszyu didn't seem to have the right game plan, and he didn't seem to be able to take advantage of his opponent's weaknesses. It seemed like he couldn't even find them weaknesses, where Bakhrum Murtazaliev was able to capitalize on Tim Tszyu's weaknesses, or expose things in Tim's game that can be weaknesses if you fight a certain way. And I think that's what Bakhrum did. He fought a certain way because he's seen weaknesses or seen things in Tim's game, how he fought in the past, and how he can expose him with openings. So that was a big factor, how each fighter approached the fight and how they used the intel from their opponent to find weaknesses and gaps. And this isn't just from the fighter as well. So a lot of this stuff is done with the trainers, and the trainers should be all over this as well, because the trainers need to plan and train their fighter to work on those punches, those combinations, the footwork, certain things that you need to do to expose that fighter. They need to know what those things are, and they need to work on that more than the other things within your training schedule. That should be the main thing. Focus on the techniques and the tactics that you're going to use, that your fighter is going to use to win this fight, to be able to expose their opponent and win this fight. And I feel that whether it was Tim Tszyu not working to the game plan that they had, or Tim Tszyu and his trainers not exposing the opponent of Tim in the right way. But there's more to it than just that. You've also got to realize what they're going to try to expose of you and combat that. The Art of War. George Kambosos. I don't know if he's ever read The Art of War or if he ever even goes by what is said in The Art of War, but that is exactly what it is. It's a tactic. It's a chess match. You got to know what your opponent is going to do. You got to know what they're going to do to try and counter what you're going to do. So, what are your weaknesses? What are they going to try to target? And how are you going to combat that? How are you going to expose them from trying to target your weaknesses? But that was definitely a key factor, I think, was the way that each fighter approached the fight. One guy had a game plan and he knew how to expose the fighter, and that left hook was there all day and he knew it and he kept on at it and it worked for him and he just couldn't miss. That right hand as well, couldn't miss. He was just countering Tim. He was just exposing him with his hands down. And Tim's defense was dreadful. He really needs to work on his defense. Okay, the second thing that I think was a big factor to Tim losing this, and this kind of ties in with knowing your opponent and knowing their weaknesses and exposing them weaknesses. There was an interview that I seen and I couldn't remember how long ago it was, what fight it was for, but I remember seeing this interview with Tim Tszyu and it was a red flag for me. As soon as I seen it, I was like, you're either lying about this or you're crazy not to implement this in your lead up to a fight. Anywho, this is the part of the interview that raised red flags for me.
Bakhrum Murtazaliev, what are his strengths? What do you need to be mindful of on fight night?
I don't really know, man. we'll see on fight night. Haven't really watched too much of him, but I don't really watch much of my opponents anyway, so I got an idea. He's taller, he punches a lot. He's got certain weird shots, but yeah, it's about it.
How can you be fighting someone for a world title and not study them, not watch their fights back over and over and over again? You need to know the ins and outs of your opponent. You need to study them. You need to understand every move that they do. You need to be dreaming of their moves. And that, to me, when he said that, I'm thinking he's either lying or he's telling the truth. And if he's lying, yep, fair enough. I don't know why you would lie about that. I don't see the motive. But if he's telling the truth, then that is crazy. If you're not watching the fighter that you're going to fight, you're not studying him, you're not watching everything that he does, watching for his weaknesses, seeing how you can expose him, and just visualizing it as well. Boxing is a mental game. If you continue to watch your opponent and see what they do, it's going to come a lot easier for you on fight night. It's going to come like what you do, your game plan, and how you implement your game plan is going to be so much easier if you already have that fighter in your head and you already know what they're likely to do. Because everyone has habits, and especially in the fighting game, and everyone has certain styles, and you have to understand the style that you're up against. You have to understand the opponent that you're up against and understand their habits and weaknesses. So for him not to watch much, not just of Bakhrum Murtazaliev, but any of his opponents, I find that pretty crazy. Which, if it is true, it also highlights that Tim is good at adapting. He's good at just getting in the ring and just adapting on the night, which is great. It's a great advantage to have. But imagine if you didn't have to adapt for every fight. I'm sure, yes, he knows his opponent, knows he's tall, and he gets told things from his trainers, and I'm sure they work on things, and I would hope that the trainer would watch a lot of the footage and work on things, get him to work on things that will help expose his opponent. But I just think mentally you need to watch your opponent's fights and understand what they're going to do. I just find that crazy, and I think that is definitely a big factor to why he lost this fight. Imagine if he watched his opponents and still had that ability to adapt. You've done all that mental training to focus on your fighter, but then if things change on that, and on fight night, you can adapt. So that means if fighters are watching tapes of Tim and they're able to change their game plan and adapt to what they're doing, that means he has to adapt to their changes. Which is, yes, okay, you have to adapt to their changes anyway, but you don't have that mental work of watching your opponent and understanding every move that they do, and then, yep, you can adapt, but they're going to go back to the same sort of style that they were doing. So if Tim Tszyu isn't watching his opponents, then he must be very adaptive fighter, which he is, and it's shown. Look at the Fundora fight with the blood. The first couple of rounds with the blood streaming down the face was a bit difficult for him, but he adapted to that, and he started coming back and actually winning some rounds. So that just shows he does have that adaptive ability. But you have to put in that mental work of watching your opponent, because that gives you that edge, and they're probably doing the same thing. So if anything, it's keeping up with them and maintaining the edge that they're probably going to have as well. So that I just thought it just stood out to me, and I just thought that that's crazy. We have all the technology these days. Even at the lower levels, you can watch your opponents if you're lucky, because there's so many fights that get recorded and there's so much fight footage out there. So we're lucky to be able to have the technology for fighters to watch their opponents back. And it's a tool you want to use to have an advantage, or at least not be disadvantaged by not using that tool when your opponent does. Anyway, I just thought that was something that stood out to me, and after the fight, it was just in my head, and I just thought that interview just it must be true what he's saying. He doesn't really watch his opponents, and I'm assuming that he lets his trainers study his opponent and then just lets his trainers train him the way he needs to be trained for the fight. That's what I would assume, but I don't know. Anyway, you have to give Tim credit. He's had 2 tough fights and he's willing to fight anybody. So not many fighters in boxing are willing to just fight anybody. So that's credit that you have to give Tim. Fought Fondora, had that cut, just battled through it. Fought Bakhrum Murtazaliev and gets knocked down and kept on getting up. So the toughness is there. The heart is there. I think they just need to work on a few things, like defense and like studying your opponent and understanding how you're going to change your game plan to beat your opponent, and anticipate what they're going to do to change their game plan, and then change your game plan again to counter that. It's a chess match. Anyway, I just thought I would highlight that and just put my 2 cents in there from what I think is, I don't know, a big factor to me. His defense, his game plan going into the fight compared to Bakhrum Murtazaliev's game plan, and the fact that he doesn't study his fighters. And if that's the case, I think it needs to change. I know a lot of people have opinions and different ideas and different thoughts. And yep, this is a bit of a setback for Tim, but he still can come back from this. He just has a long road ahead of him at the moment, and he just needs to take his time, and I think him and his team have a lot to work on. But he can do it. Anyway, what are your thoughts on this? Why do you think Tim lost? Is he just not that type of fighter? Is he just not as good as what everyone says he is? Do you think what I'm saying is valid? Do you think the fact that he doesn't watch his opponents is a factor? Do you think it was just down to him not coming in with a game plan and his opponent coming in with a game plan and executing it well? What are your thoughts? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below, and until next time, peace out.
Myths in boxing, highlight real scene, front row seats to the blow by blow scene.